Welcome to the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. I'm Christian of Standing Stones Healing, founder of the Reiki Business Collective and creator of the Build Your Reiki Business program, sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. Greetings, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode of the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. It's Christian of Standing Stones Healing, and I am, of course, excited to have you here with me as always. So thank you so very much. This week's episode is about consistency. Being consistent in your Reiki business. But first, I do want to please encourage you to mark on your calendar the weekend of November 23rd and 24th. We have a very special live Reiki business event coming up that you will not want to miss. More information is forthcoming, but please, in the meantime, save that date. Consistency, of course, is doing something over and over again, doing something on a regular basis. Being consistent is really just about repeating and not necessarily repeating a specific interval. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that distinction is important to make up front because consistency in being consistent in our Reiki business isn't one specific thing. It is, however, important. And it's important because consistency really defines who we are. Now, hold on one second before you start scratching your head and saying, wait a minute, Christian, what the heck? You're telling me that I am defined by whether or not I am consistent? And yes, actually, yes. What I mean by that is that people define us by who we are in terms of what we do. And people will define us by our actions and therefore the predictability of those actions. And so if we are someone who acts in a consistent kind of manner, people can get an idea of who we are and how we might act in a similar kind of scenario. For instance, with this podcast, I start the podcast off thanking you for being here, welcoming you. I say it in like exactly the same way every time. You might begin to think that it's a recording. It's not. It's just the way that I always say it. It's predictable. And so if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you know how I'm going to welcome you to the podcast. And if I were to do something different, it might surprise you because that has become a predictable pattern of the way of doing things. If we zoom out and take a larger look at it, it can really help people to understand who we are and how we operate in terms of things like, this person I know is going to react in this kind of way. Or if I say this particular kind of thing to someone, they're going to do this or take this action. It's all about that idea of predictability of someone's behavior, which helps people to understand us and to even feel comfortable with us. It's when we are unpredictable, when we are inconsistent in our reactions, in the ways in which we operate, that can create an unsettled kind of experience or feeling for other people in our lives. You know, this, of course, is very true if in our childhood, we had parents who were maybe abusive or unpredictable. That unpredictability created a sense of a lack of safety oftentimes and fearfulness. Now, this is an extreme example, but where I'm going with this is that predictability of our behavior really helps people to feel safe around us. That consistency means that people feel like they know who we are because they've got an idea of what they can expect from us. That's really what it's about. Consistency is really about setting up expectations. That predictability is really about the expectation. Like, oh, if you tune into an episode of the podcast, you can expect that Christian is going to welcome you in the same kind of way, that the podcast itself is going to be around 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, but it's not going to be an hour long. You can expect that it's going to come out once a week. You can expect that it's going to come out on Monday. Those are simply expectations that have been set up for the podcast with the consistency. So consistency is important in our Reiki business because it helps our clients, our potential clients, our followers, our audience to understand and be able to predict and have expectations around how we will show up. And so, for instance, if you start your Reiki sessions in one particular way, every time a client comes to you, that can really help to create a sense of safety for the client because they know what they can expect. Whereas if they went into one of your sessions and it was completely different from the last time they met with you, that might be unsettling for the client because it's different. It was not what they were expecting. And anytime there's a mismatch between our expectations and what happens, it's unsettling for us. And so if a client goes into a Reiki session with us expecting one thing and they get something very different, it's unsettling to the client. And so if you tuned into this podcast every week and then one week you got something very different, whether that's positive or not, it's going to be a bit unsettling for you. And so expectations are important for us in our Reiki business because they help the client to know what to expect. And they help the client to have a sense of security and a sense of safety with us and with their interactions with our Reiki business. And so consistency in our Reiki business all across the board, I believe, is very important. When we are irregular in our Reiki business, it is going to leave a client wondering exactly what to expect and wondering even what kind of person or Reiki business owner we are. And so in our Reiki business, I believe consistency is important because it sets expectations for our client and it allows them to feel comfortable in knowing who we are based on how we have acted in the past. I mean, this is just typical behavioral stuff, right? And so consistency, I believe, is important. And when I say consistency, I mean something from the way in which we start and end a session and what a client can expect in the session to whether or not our podcast is weekly. Let's say, for instance, as someone tuning into this podcast, that I had an irregular podcast schedule. You know, my podcasts are weekly. The podcast has been airing for more than a year now, and it is weekly. New episodes are released every Monday at 9 a.m., and that is very predictable. That schedule has been the case for more than a year, and that is going to continue to be the schedule. And so if you tuned into the podcast one week and then you tuned in next week and there was no episode, you might think, well, that was strange. I was expecting an episode. But then let's say you tuned in next week and, oh, there's no episode again. Well, that's strange. That's out of the ordinary. That's not what I was expecting. And then maybe I uploaded one the week after that and you thought, great, okay, we're back to normal now. But then 3 weeks go by and there isn't another episode. At this point, you're really thinking something strange is going on. You might be wondering, what's happening with Christian? What's happening with the podcast? Is the podcast going away? Is Christian having some kind of challenges in his life? Why is he not doing a podcast regularly? What's up with the schedule? And if this kind of irregularity continued, maybe I'd upload 1 week, maybe skip a couple weeks, maybe every 3 weeks, once a month, whenever, whatever, maybe twice in a row, you would start to wonder, and even indeed, you'd stop listening, because you might think, why should I bother tuning in? Because I don't know if there's going to be a new episode. Why should I bother listening to a podcast if it's not consistent? Why should I bother checking if the chances are I probably won't get an episode? And if I do, maybe I'll get an episode here or there. That indeed would happen if the Build Your Reiki Business podcast was not a consistently weekly published podcast, or at least not consistently. I'll get to that weekly bit in a moment. And so people would only listen in as far as they understood the schedule and could get into a rhythm and felt positive about that when it was predictable. It's that predictability aspect, the setting up of expectations and meeting those expectations with consistency that is so important. Without it, your audience doesn't know what to expect, and therefore your audience doesn't know you. And when we act in an inconsistent manner, whether that's publishing a podcast episode just every once in a while without a particular schedule, or that is doing something out of character that is inconsistent with our character, then our clients, our students, our audience begins to wonder who we are because their expectations are not being met, and that is unsettling. Now, for me in my Reiki business, consistency is something that I'm very good at. And as a matter of fact, consistency is something that I'm very good at throughout all aspects of my life. I behave very consistently. I'm very predictable in the terms of the ways in which I might react to something. I'm very predictable in terms of my behaviors. And so I believe that one of the reasons people feel comfortable and safe around me is because as they get to know me, they get to know that I'm going to react in very predictable kinds of ways. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that's a very good thing. And I will say that I am very blessed that as a child, I had a very predictable, stable upbringing. I've got a pretty strong root chakra. And so that has translated in my life into a real ability to be consistent, to stay consistent, to do things consistently. So thanks, Mom and Dad. But if we're challenged to be consistent in our Reiki business, I have a couple of points for us to consider. Now, first of all, when I talk about consistency, this can mean different things. So consistency might mean publishing a podcast every week, or it could be every other week, or once a month. But once we get into a rhythm, sticking with that rhythm, whatever it might be, just helps to meet our client and student and audience expectations. So it's all about meeting the expectations. Whether you publish a YouTube video once a week, 3 times a week, once a month, or whatever it might be. Now, if we're showing up consistently, it doesn't always have to be on an exact schedule. My guess is that if I published a podcast episode on a Tuesday rather than a Monday, most listeners are not going to be really fussed about that. Most podcast listeners are not going to be so unsettled that they're like, oh my gosh, what is this Christian guy doing? He published on a Tuesday instead of a Monday. I just can't trust him anymore. But rather, showing up consistently can and does look in a wide variety of ways. And what really matters in that consistency is that we are continuing to show up for our clients and to let them know that we are there, that we're not going anywhere, that they can trust us and trust our Reiki business. At the core of consistency is establishing trust. And as long as we are showing up in our Reiki business, posting content regularly, being consistent in the ways in which we show up, how we interact, how we are in our sessions from session to session or class to class, and our behavior and demeanor, so even if we're not posting content, this applies to all of us as well. Something that I see happen again and again with many Reiki business owners, they'll put out some content, maybe a couple of YouTube videos. They will stop, they'll go away for months and months at a time, even for a year or more at a time, and then come back, start posting more, and then they're gone again. There's no way that we can build an audience in our Reiki business with that kind of inconsistency, because people typically want to follow and learn from and connect with people who aren't going to suddenly disappear and go away. Now, there's nothing wrong in our Reiki business with growing our Reiki business, building our Reiki business at our own pace, because indeed we all build at our own pace. But it is so much better for our Reiki business to lay one brick at a time and to do so consistently again and again and again, rather than to lay 5 bricks in a row and then take a break for a month and then come back and lay 10 more bricks and then take a break for 2 months. It's so much better to consistently be laying down bricks. I don't think there's any better example of this idea of consistency and the power of consistency than the tortoise and the hare. We all know that story, right? Where the tortoise and the hare are racing, and the hare gets so far ahead of the tortoise that the hare thinks it has won. It takes a nap, and the tortoise ends up winning because it is consistent. It just keeps moving forward. And maybe it's moving forward at a slower pace, but it gets so much farther because it keeps going. It's consistent. And so in our Reiki business, when we are worried about moving so far and getting so far ahead and doing all of the things and getting all of the clients, we are so much better off building more slowly and in a consistent, repeatable manner than we are doing a bunch of things, maybe gaining a bunch of followers, having a bunch of sessions, and then stopping for who knows how long, because we're stopping inconsistently, and we may not even know how long we're stopping for ourselves, and then coming back and being like the hare and rushing again. Whereas if we just were like the tortoise, then indeed we would be able to move forward in a powerful way because we're moving forward in a consistent way. You know, to me, this reminds me also so much of the precept of just for today, I will do my work diligently or honestly or however you translate it. But this idea of just putting forth the effort again and again and again, doing that work honestly in terms of that consistency and continuing to apply ourselves and move forward. Let's take inspiration from the tortoise and the consistency of the tortoise in our Reiki business. So when you are working on building your Reiki business, it's okay to lean into the power of the small and to move forward in small incremental ways. That's much more powerful than doing a bunch and then stopping. So don't underestimate the power of the small. Don't underestimate the power of repeated actions that are done again and again and again. There's a wonderful philosophy called Kaizen, and I really love Kaizen. If you haven't heard of it, I encourage you to look it up, Kaizen. And there's a wonderful book on the topic, and it's by Robert Maurer. Robert Maurer has written a couple of books on Kaizen. One Small Step Can Change Your Life, and The Spirit of Kaizen. I actually recommend that book first. I think it's smaller, it's more succinct, and it's just a wonderful introduction to Kaizen. So The Spirit of Kaizen by Robert Maurer, Maurer. But Kaizen is a Japanese philosophy of continuous improvement. And so getting better and better in small increments and changing small things to get better. And then the compounding effect of that creates big changes and big improvements. And so Kaizen is really about consistency and about improving and doing better in small incremental ways and just continuing to show up, continuing to put forth effort. So Kaizen, I believe, is really powerful for us in our Reiki business to help us with moving forward consistently, knowing that we don't need to do big, grand, sweeping things all at once, all of the time, that Kaizen really encourages us, like the tortoise, to move forward in small ways and to trust in the compounding effect of the consistency of doing little things again and again and again. And so that might look like in our Reiki business, doing the small thing of a podcast episode every week, again and again and again. That might look like a YouTube video once a week, even once a month, but again and again and again. That might look like reaching out to 5 potential clients again and again and again. And doing those things consistently, showing up in ways that are consistent, that really help our clients and our potential clients to be able to trust us, to know that we're not going away, to know that we're not magically disappearing. By the way, if I magically disappear at some point, something is wrong. If I magically disappear without notice, please know that I'm not okay. Because I'm consistent, and I wouldn't do that. Because you show up to listen, I'm honored by that, and I do not take that for granted. And so once we build up that trust with our clients, our potential clients, students, audience, followers, it's important for us to honor that trust and to not take it for granted. So I want you to know that I don't take you for granted, and I thank you for showing up and tuning in each week, whether you tune in consistently or inconsistently. I'm happy to have you here. And of course, as always, you are welcome to get the free Reiki Biz Kit at standingstoneshealing.com/Reiki Biz Kit, and to join us in the Reiki Business Collective at facebook.com/groups/Reiki Biz. Sending so many blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. What does consistency mean to you in your Reiki business? Drop it down below for us if you're on YouTube, or share it with us in the Reiki Business Collective. Sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. Thanks for tuning in to the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, and send to a friend. Learn more about the Build Your Reiki Business program at standingstoneshealing.com/build. Sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business.